Europeans have been deprived or deprived themselves of sovereign political will. They become, in effect, politically denatured, and let's face it, that's reality. And they will not count the United States, and in fact, they anticipate an American lead on all matters of foreign policy consequence. Given the forces at work in the United States, it's what happens in the United States and what shapes American foreign policy. And in the case we're talking about, these deep American empathy and total backing and identification with Israel for a variety of reasons, a couple of which we just pointed out, which dominates American thinking and directs American policy. That policy then is simply accepted without question by Europe.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm joined for the third time by the always brilliant Dr. Michael Brenner, who's a professor emeritus of international affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Michael keeps writing pieces that hit home hard, the latest one being Europe, the Jews, and the Muslim World, in which he reflects on the insane and inhumane way Europe is treating the Palestinians, basically trying to sell the idea that all the deaths in Gaza and the West Bank are that we are seeing now is on the hands of Hamas. Never mind, it's Israel's bombs that's killing them. This is going to be our discussion today, so welcome back to the channel, Michael.
Pleased to be with you, Pascal.
Michael, so you start your essay with the following observation, and I quote you here: Europe has an obsession about Jews. For nearly 2 millennia, it hated them and persecuted them. Now, after a respite of a few decades, it condemns and abuses Muslims in a similar way, all in the name of supporting Jews. I think it was Caitlin Johnstone who wrote that the greatest trick of the anti-Semites was to resettle all of Europe's Jews in the Middle East and then have these Jews kill the Muslims. And I think your argument goes in a similar direction, but can you explain to me how you're seeing the tragedy that we watch unfolding?
Yes, I mean, this is one of those singular instances, historical episodes, in which one has to approach, I think, more in terms of psychology, collective psychology and behavior, than in terms of the calculations of statesmen about national interest. And therefore, we should look sort of less about their worldview and their place in the configuration of power of the world than the background and the context. And that background, of course, has a very influential historical, dimension. I think in order to understand what seems to be a very sort of peculiar, indeed irrational in the sense of being not logically thought through, but deeply emotional approach that European governments and political elites, and seemingly most of the populace as well, of course, although they've been conditioned and led by the political elites to think in a certain way and in a certain manner, and to pick favorites and decide almost arbitrarily who is good and virtuous and who is bad and who is evil. In any case, I think the three key elements, or three key factors to keep in mind is that first, of course, is history, right? As I noted, Jews have had not a central place in European history, but have been a focus and a prominence and a fixed place in the European mind for sort of obvious reasons, going back to Christianity's emergence out of Judaism, And the Great Divide, in effect, if we want to call it that, occurred with the birth of Christianity and the crucifixion of Christ, for which Jews have been held culpable. Although that responsibility in historical terms obviously is shared by the Roman authorities and Pilate, and Pontius Pilate in particular. And that has lasted only enough, close to 2 millennia. And of course, it has changed somewhat. It's been modified, certainly since the Enlightenment and since the liberation of the Jews from the ghetto by Napoleon, and the Jews' assimilation into increasingly sort of secularized European societies over the past 2 centuries. That whole relationship, of course, was anti-Semitism, which lived on, became less virulent, and manifested itself in less overt, coercive, or even violent ways in most of Europe, with some exceptions like the pogroms in Tsarist Russia, and some of the abuses that occurred in terms of Eastern European Jewish communities during World War I, in which atrocities against Jews were conducted by both sides on the Eastern Front. Of course, with the Holocaust, sort of things changed dramatically, and it became, considered abhorrent. Anti-Semitism in general became abhorrent, and of course, the crystallization left, where there was a crystallization, a whole new attitude towards Jews, which was colored by a sense of collective guilt in the case of the Germans in particular, but a general sense of responsibility for the maltreatment of Jews over the centuries. And one practical way, of course, in which this has manifested itself has been support, and strong support, which has both been mainly political, emotional, and some practical, for the state of Israel, who owes its existence probably to the Holocaust, although it was Lord Balfour and the Balfour Declaration which set the process in motion back in, 1917. And so what we are seeing now, I think, is evidence and manifestation of how deep the Jewish presence in all its aspects, in all of the tangled emotions associated with Jews, have been there, like very much, and now very much alive. And I think it's impossible to understand what currently is being demonstrated in terms of the sort of uncritical and the unqualified support for Israel and everything it does, which we are seeing, and which is sort of deeply disturbing, and I think cannot be understood except in reference to the collective psychology of not just the European mind, but the American mind. The difference here, in the second element, of course, is European dependence on the United States. And the United States has assumed custodial responsibility since 1960, late 1950s, the 56 war, and certainly by the 67 war, for not only the security, the physical security, but the well-being of Israel. And much of, if not all of, American policy in the Middle East has to be understood, and this simply is an objective fact of international diplomatic life. It has skewed Americans' approach to the whole panoply, the whole spectrum of Middle East issues. Now, that itself is something which needs exploration, this is not the occasion to go into it, because Americans, after all, don't have the same feelings, immediate feelings of guilt with regard to the most extreme forms of anti-Semitism, which Europe does, in terms of what's called a Christian mind and experience, if you like. That sensing was much more abstract. I mean, America was apart from, of course, the events of World War II as regards to the extermination of a large part of the Jewish population. There is, though, enormous influence by Jewish organization, what's called the Zionist lobby in the United States, which we must acknowledge. The other and very peculiar factor is the strength and the growing strength of what's called the Christian right. And the Christian right emerges from the evangelical churches, which have grown enormously, both in terms of membership and in terms of political activity and in American society generally. And the evangelicals, for them, their theological, if you would, eschatological view of the world and of their place in it derives from the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation is connected to Israel insofar as it foresees Armageddon and the final day of judgment and ultimately leading to the rapture, right? Which is the second coming of Jesus Christ and Jesus bringing it to, into the divine, the believers, right? And the surest sign that this is going to occur, that the day of judgment was approaching, would be the reestablishment of the Jews in the Holy Land. And of course, its culmination, according to the book of Revelation and in the minds of these evangelicals, would be in effect the reappearing Christ, offering once again the Jews to see the light and to embrace him and therefore save themselves. And those who do not would fall into Hades along with other non-believers, and those who do will join the faithful Christians in paradise. And you say, my God, do these people really believe that? Is this the way they orient themselves to regard the great issues of war and peace in the Middle East? And the answer is yes. And they're particularly influential in the Republican Party now. They constitute a very significant segment of what you might call the radical right. The Trump movement is another way of depicting it. As a consequence, in effect, given Europe's subordination to the United States, this sort of voluntary subordination, the way in which there's a peculiar dominant subordinate relationship, behavioral relationship between Europe and the United States, which has taken shape and has become so deeply entrenched since the end of World War II. Europeans have been deprived or deprived themselves of sovereign political will. They become, in effect, politically denatured, and let's face it, that's reality. And they will not count the United States, and in fact, they anticipate an American lead on all matters of foreign policy consequence. And so given the forces at work in the United States, and let me quickly add, well, anyway, given the forces at work in the United States, it's what happens in the United States and what shapes American foreign policy. And in the case we're talking about, these deep American empathy and total backing and identification with Israel for a variety of reasons, a couple of which we just pointed out, which dominates American thinking and directs American policy. That policy then is simply accepted without question by Europe. And I mean, so just to add something here, well, add something here, and that is one of the oddities is, and as I write in this essay, is that Europe is part of two dominant subordinate relationships. In the relationship with the United States, it's the subordinate party. And in relationship to the Arab world, right, and the Muslim world in general, it is a dominant party. And this is not just because it's empathy for Israel, but because of other historical forces, including colonialism and the post-colonial residue, if you like, to results in a lack of empathy, to put it mildly, of non-Western peoples. And the Jews are given the status of honorary Westerners, if you like. Now, this, of course, is a perfect example of what's called the authoritarian personality. The authoritarian personality is a personality which, in reference to its behavior, in reference to its superior and the dominant party, is obsequious, right, passive, obedient, and so on. And then with regard to its inferiors or own subordinates, it is arrogant, demanding, and patronizing. And so there you have this sort of odd, I don't know what you want to call it, sort of paradoxical, that Europe behaves exactly as collectively and across the continent, exactly as the textbooks describe an authoritarian, personality. And I think all of this is central to understanding what's going on now in regard to both the American-European relationship and the European-Israel-Palestine relationship and the American-Israel-Palestine relationship. Because regard to the last, the Europeans, in effect, validate and give support for and to the United States, and rather than posing any kind of skeptical questions, indeed, it reinforces the American inclination to do what it's doing.
But Europe has a big problem, and so does the United States, which is, in regard to Israel-Palestine, the conventional narrative, especially the one that they've been building up over the last 10 and certainly the last 2 years of value-based foreign policy, is obviously and unredeemably destroyed, or is crumbling and falling and completely collapsing so hard that even within Western societies, the utter hypocrisy is not concealable anymore, right? When you keep emphasizing human rights, and everything is about human rights, and then suddenly you have one side that is so utterly disproportionately strikes the other side and kills indiscriminately civilians, men, women, children. We are recording this on October 31st, and at this point we know that without doubt more than 8,000 Palestinians have already died, and a good half of them are children. And this is just so outrageously humongous that even inside Europe we have now these large protests that say, like, hey, wait a second, this is not what we signed up for. And I do think that your analysis is correct, but so what does this psychological subordination to the United States in Europe, what do you think this will lead to? Because by now it's not concealable anymore that the value idea is pure hubris, and this is pulling the rug under the feet of a lot of Europeans actually, yes, at the moment.
Yes. I think what the Western leaders in Western societies, fail to recognize that this is a sort of a culmination of a process underway for a few years now, by which the West has lost its moral standing. I'm not saying we don't use the term moral authority because the U.S. really hasn't had much moral authority. The United States, for a certain period in its history, was seen in the world as being not quite the city on the hill and predestined to lead the world to the path of enlightenment, as Americans believe, but at least it was seen as being a society from which we would expect a certain decency of behavior, humanity, a concern for what the social scientists would call creating public goods or welfare.
And at least by the people themselves believing that, right? That's the important
Americans
thing. The people inside, the
fact,
Americans and the Europeans, they believe that that's what it is.
And Europeans will historically believed that of the United States. I mean, it wasn't just the Europeans. I mean, after all, Ho Chi Minh in China hoped the United States would support Vietnam's move for independence based on its own Revolutionary War and independence movement, and the 1770s and 1780s, and he wanted to issue a Declaration of Independence model on that drafted by George Washington. But anyway, let's not go astray on that. So I think we have another puzzle now here. How do you explain the seeming inability of Western elites to recognize an historic break, not just historical, but an historic break, whereby the West is separating itself from much of the rest of the world? And it's separating itself. Well, it's been separating itself. The divide has been opening on geopolitical grounds for a decade or two, but now on moral grounds, on this very issue of values. And we still pretend that the West, and the United States particularly, is a cynosure of some kind of values which have universal applicability and are superior in humanistic terms than those of any other civilization or society. And that's been completely shredded and lost. This is an objective truth which nobody dare admit, and nobody dare even acknowledge, because you can't admit something unless you acknowledge it, and it isn't acknowledged. And I think this poses a behavioral puzzle, which we have to examine very carefully and try to understand, because in my view, it represents a collective psychopathology.
Can you expand on that, the collective psychopathology?
Well, I think, Frank, to be very blunt about it, what we're observing is mass hysteria. Hysteria on this magnitude, because it's been known in history, and the psychological dynamic. Well, let's say what's hysteria? Well, the purest examples are ones we've known. Let's think of a medieval convent, right? A medieval convent populated by sort of young women, right? And the most emotionally vulnerable and whatever young woman suddenly loses it, and she becomes hysterical, and she starts writing things on the wall and screaming. He says, I am possessed by a lecherous, diabolical agent sent by Satan. Satan, sorry. And of course, that's happened. It's happened right into the 19th century, if you like. And then it spreads. And then suddenly one of the young nuns after another says, I'm possessed too. And it begins to behave the same way. And all bedlam breaks out. And then the mother's superior, together with the local exorcist, try and contain it. And there are other manifestations analogous to that. We've seen some of the mass movements can become hysterical.
Yeah,
and the Nuremberg rallies were exercises in mass hysteria. What we haven't, and then someone who's skeptical can say, "What are you talking about? Hysteria? This is the 21st century. The societies and the members whose members you're referring to are educated. They are not adherents to some sort of extreme creed or movement. They are schooled in civic ethics. How can you say that they are hysterical and that we are observing mass hysteria?" Well, that's the puzzle. That's the intellectual puzzle, because objectively speaking, the behavior we are observing matches very closely the model of mass hysteria. And so how do you explain mass hysteria in societies like contemporary Western societies? And it's very hard to do because it seems to be unprecedented. Let me just take a couple of seconds. Well, first of all, you have purges. You have people who dissent. All you have to do in the United States or Germany or the UK is to say that you sympathize with the Palestinians. All you have to do is to use the phrase "from the river to the sea," no matter what you mean by it, right? And you are liable to lose your job. Your application for a faculty position at a university might be rejected. Your application for enrollment at a university might be rejected. If you are a public figure, you're likely to be castigated. If you're a member of the Labour Party in Britain, you are condemned, right? So this is a sort of a form of excommunication, a form of persecution, which calls up remembered images of
witch trials,
hysterical religious movements in the Inquisition, or the kinds of hysteria, small-scale hysteria in convents we've talked about. And this is an extraordinary phenomenon of enormous consequence, both externally in regard to our acceptance of what now amounts to mass slaughter and crimes against humanity in Gaza, and also what they mean for our societies. I mean, this is not, certainly in the United States or UK, which I have, most awareness of, this is not entirely isolated, right? Let's not forget, we experience milder versions of this after 9/11, the war on terror, and led to all kinds of abuses at home as well as abroad. Then we began to get the rabid anti-Russian phobia that was still going on, in which you had courses in universities, modified curriculum so as to exclude Russian authors. You have great artists like Anna Netrebko having all the contracts canceled and cannot perform anywhere. Why? Because she was once photographed with Vladimir Putin at a concert that was designed to support and to raise funds for the Russians of the Donbass who had been expelled and shelled by the Ukrainians. So, we've had that. Now you have, certainly in the United States, although it's spreading because the neural pathways are always go from the United States to Europe, the anti-China mania, the casting China as an immutable threat, potential fatal threat to the United States. Of which there is no evidence whatsoever. There's no threat from China to the basic core interest, much less the integrity of the United States. And now we see in one might say its purest form manifest in regard to Gaza and the Palestinians. So I think there's, a double concern. One, how to explain it, which is very, very difficult to do. And second, it's a challenge of anticipating what all the, deleterious consequences are going to be, both internationally, specifically in regard to Israel and Palestine, more generally in regard to the alienation of the West from much of the rest of the world, and three, how it is going to rebound and affect civil liberties and open discourse in our own societies, because once you have shown a readiness to so severely limit free expression of views on any one issue, that attitude and that readiness is going to not disappear immediately, even when focus has shifted elsewhere.
Yeah, and what you said, I think, is especially important, the mass psychosis aspect of the tragedy we are witnessing, because it seems to me that it's somehow built into the system that at some point, when psychologically, when communities, epistemic communities, feel so superior to everybody else, that they would land themselves in that situation. We don't even have to go far back in order to explain how suddenly an idea can radically change basic behavioral patterns and basic moral prescriptions, right? We've just gone through 3 years of radical change in our societies, where suddenly, in order to go to a restaurant, you needed to have a piece of paper, and unless you had the piece of paper, you couldn't go to the restaurant. And the whole Corona moment, whether that threat was real or not, the point is the belief in the threat, whether it's real or not, will justify the same actions. And we go back to this issue that the belief, not the actual, not an actual outside force, but the belief in a force will motivate people to do just the way that religion does, right? It's motivated through the belief that X is the case, and once you believe that, then you do everything to go toward X. And since we're already talking also about the connection with religion, I remember this quote, and I'm not a believer, I'm an atheist, but the quote of the greatest trick of the devil was to make people believe that he didn't exist, right? In the same sense of our societies believing that we're so enlightened that something as crazy as witch hunts could never happen to us again. I mean, that's baked into the new witch hunts and the new mass psychosis, right? The belief that it cannot happen to us. I mean, because it only happens to stupid people in the past, right? We're so enlightened that, of course, we are above all of this madness. While you're literally the bad man, basically tattering around on the street, right? But we have this dramatic shift that you pointed out, which is that large parts of the world don't follow. They shake their head in disbelief. certainly in the Middle East, certainly in Asia, certainly in Africa, and also in South America. We can see how now even more massively than in the Russia-Ukraine war, the rest of the world is basically saying, like, stop it, guys. This is madness. And it is ostracizing this part even further, but also inside. The one thing that gives me a bit of hope is that apparently the mass psychosis that we're seeing is something that has gripped the European elites and the US elites, because we see massive protests right now. So do you think there's a chance of breaking this self-destructive or highly inhumane psychological paradigm that now leads Europe to basically okay genocide in the Middle East?
Well, in most circumstances, as my psychiatrist friends have told me in the past, that when one, just think of individuals first, reach a condition in which they dissociate from reality. They no longer recognize and guide themselves by a true and accurate understanding as to what the condition of things is, right? Reality, in other words. That the only thing that forces them to change is when they bump their heads against that reality and cause themselves considerable damage, and they are unable to do the things they want to do and need to do and to function and so forth, because their conception of things and reality don't match. And so, you lose your job, your friends drop you, you get divorced, et cetera, et cetera. And, if you dissociated from reality because you've been on drugs, you wind up finding yourself in a gutter one morning, in a way. The trouble is that we know what's going on now. What is the main reality we encounter? The main reality we encounter are other people, the media, our leaders, who share and, in fact, are the fountainhead of the very distorted and deformed beliefs and attitudes, which are the reason and the basis for your dissociation from reality. Now, if you think of this in collective terms, well, we bumped our heads against reality in Ukraine in regard to our total misconception of Russia, its capabilities, et cetera. Although we're making the same mistake in reference to China. In regard to the specific issue of Palestine and Hamas, I'm not sure how reality is going to inflict such negative effects on the West, and particularly the United States, as to have a shock effect, shock therapy, and get us to come to terms with the reality and our own distortions of it and our behaviors that flow from those distortions. What could it be? I mean, if you're willing to tolerate what's going on in Gaza, not just tolerate, the United States has participated. The United States has sent weapons. The United States military personnel have gone to Israel to help them design a plan for the assault on Gaza. The United States spearheaded, we now know, thanks to some memos which have been divulged, the effort to convince the Egyptians to accept 2 million Gazans expelled from Gaza to live in tent cities that would be financed by Qatar in the Sinai Desert. First Secretary Blinken and then President Biden visited, and Biden picked up his phone and spoke to President al-Sisi, cajoling him to do exactly that. And I say, if you do that, we'll forego some of the debt. Egypt is highly indebted, and we'll write it off if you'll participate in this crime against humanity. So the United States and Europe, to somewhat lesser extent in terms of overt and direct involvement, is a direct participant in this. So in legal, you call yourself a belligerent in war crimes. So how do you, once you've accepted that, I mean, what sort of shock can force a reversal? It's hard to see.
A war with Iran, which seems to be in the preparation right now, with 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the region, and apparently over the last couple of days, over 50 aircraft from the US transferring quite a lot of assets to the Middle East. There seems to be preparations going on for a major US involvement, one that obviously won't be against Gaza. I do fear that the neocons at the moment want to use the opportunity and actually have a war with Iran, which is going to be an entirely different level from what we had in Iraq. Entirely different.
You're absolutely right. And there are people today in Washington in high positions who want a war with Iran, and they've wanted a war with Iran for the last 15 years. And they include our Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, and our Security Advisor, Mr. Sullivan, our Deputy Secretary of State, Ms. Nuland, and it's the inclination of Joe Biden. Although what, if anything, goes through Joe Biden's head at this point is unclear.
Anyone's guess.
Yeah, is unclear. And it's clear that some of these moves are meant to bait Iran into doing something that could be used as a cause célèbre and to trigger an American attack on Iran. And that will have dire consequences for the United States. As the experts say, one of them is that first of all, some American aircraft carriers are likely to find themselves at the bottom of the sea, whether the Mediterranean or Red Sea, within 30 minutes, because they're sitting ducks for the kind of missiles now available. Certainly the Russian and Chinese, we don't know if they would get involved. They certainly would not want it, and they're counseling Iran to bite their tongue and to not to attempt it. But the hypersonic missiles, which the Chinese and the Russians have now, cannot be defended against by the United States Navy and all of those great aircraft carriers.
But the thing is, this is the way
nothing but sitting ducks. So that would be an enormous shock. Whether the Iranians themselves can do that, I don't know. And then, of course, you'd have a great global economic crisis because it would disrupt all oil supplies from the Gulf. The price of oil would shoot up to $200 a barrel. The already powerless economies of the West will collapse into depression and inflation.
Michael,
the latter would not be enough to change the deep beyond mindset psyche of the United States. Aircraft carriers at the bottom of the sea would, but you're only going to get aircraft carriers. See if you have.
I don't think so.
Catastrophe.
Michael, if Iran managed to sink a U.S. aircraft carrier, which is would be an unprecedented thing in U.S. military history, I am pretty convinced that that the neocons in Washington would nuke Tehran. I'm pretty sure we would have the first nuclear deployment since the Second World War, and I'm pretty sure it will be the capital because the U.S. doctrine is usually to decapitate the leadership, which I think this will give the neocons the excuse to use nukes.
Well, we don't know. I mean, because once you enter the realm of psychopathology, all the normal, guidelines, benchmarks, touchdowns don't apply. Yeah. Where you would get in the United States the most immediate resistance would be the military themselves. There are some people in the military who think in terms of such an effect. Most of them are very conservatives. They don't really want a war. They don't want a war with Russia. They don't want a war with China, etc. But you do have people like the current head of the Air Force, who in public last week says, my gut tells me we're going to be at war with China by the end of 2025. I mean, that is so irresponsible, so reckless. So it shows a total lack of discipline within the administration. Its significance for the question you raise is, there are some people like that who would go ahead. There were some who would very strongly oppose it, and a handful who would not obey the command. Now, of course, they would be more like those people might disobey a command if it involved an attack against China or Russia, because they know it would mean the destruction of the United States. And whereas a nuclear attack against Iran would not. There was one American commander, I think he was a naval commander, years ago, decades ago, who admitted when he retired that if he received an order to launch nuclear weapons, which were under his direct command against then the Soviet Union, he would not follow it. But of course, that's one person, and others would have, and we don't know if such a person exists today.
Is it technically possible not to follow? You need a chain of commands to kick in order for the nukes to be started.
No, at the end, it's permissive. There's nothing automatic. At some point, as best I understand, somebody actually has to do something physically for the missile to launch, for the bomb to drop, whatever. We don't have any automaticity. That's been suggested, in the past, as the ultimate deterrent, which is a tripwire, which you have no control. The trouble is, such an arrangement, which is from the point of view of deterrence is the most desirable, is the least desirable in the event of actually something happened, whether accidental or otherwise. So, as far as I know, the United States has never introduced tripwire, any kind of tripwire of that sort, nor certainly did the Soviets, and most certainly, the Russians. In fact, the Soviets, from what we know, exercised tighter control over anything having to do with the release of nuclear weapons than we did. But anyway, yes, Iran, we don't know, but the United States and particularly the people in this administration, have reached a point where that one cannot exclude anything.
Yes.
Whatever the probabilities, whatever their odds on doing X, Y, or Z, and the X in this case is using nuclear weapons against Iran in the event of hostilities between the U.S. and Iran, whatever it might be, 1 in 10, 2 in 10, 3 in 10, whatever, you cannot exclude it. It's not zero. It's not 0 in 10.
No, that's why it is so imperative that we scale down the violence and not scale it up. But it seems, as always, that the neocons are doing the exact opposite, and they're just throwing gasoline into the fire further and further. While on the other hand, there is actors who try to scale it down, and China just gets itself more and more involved in the Middle East and brings out proposals for actually diminishing the violence. I don't think this will be heeded, but we see that the international community is actually not on board, right? We had that Jordanian resolution in the UN, and actually 120 countries, and I'm so glad that for once Switzerland stood on the right side, said like yes to it, that of like calling for not for a ceasefire but for humanitarian pause. To actually stop the slaughter, right? Because the most important thing is to stop the dying, because these people are actually now it's horrendous, right? This is a ghetto that is being bombed, and the bombs keep falling, let alone any help, real help coming in. But this change that you have only 14 countries that want to go along, even though, let's be frank, the United States and Israel don't need anyone to go along. They have everything that they need themselves in order to bomb the hell out of Gaza. And, they could kill 2.3 million people. That is one of the options. If Egypt doesn't open the border, right? You can just pull a Holocaust on them, right? The Germans did it with the Jews, so why not the Israelis with the Palestinians?
Like the Warsaw Ghetto.
They have everything, right? Everything is there. But the fact that you only have another 12 countries that actually give you the thumbs up, even though we can be sure that all of the diplomatic effort has been going into this, probably more than even against in the Russia question, it does tell us that we are actually the post-Cold War, these 30 years that were called post-Cold War, this is over now. We are now in the next section of world politics.
Yes, well, one of the 3 points. First, the American foreign policy community in general finds it exceedingly difficult, again for a complex set of reasons, to acknowledge this. To give up the idea that the U.S. is the global supremo, right, is very, very hard, because the whole view of the world, of the country, of America's place in it, has been shaped by the beliefs that we are indeed exceptional, superior, and so forth. And to accept being reduced to the status of an ordinary power, even if still perhaps the strongest or one of the 2 strongest, is simply very hard for Americans, and particularly a political class, and especially the foreign policy community, to swallow. And so the intellectual adjustment is only being made on the very margins of discourse among members of this community. Back to Gaza, it seems clear that what the Russians and Chinese are doing, and they're acting in concert, again, about dissociation from reality, again, American leaders and Western leaders don't fully appreciate the extent and the depth, the durability of the Sino-Russian partnership. They've been talking on a daily basis about what to do, and they concert every move. I mean, people who know China and know Russia, I mean, to them, this is obvious. And I think their objective is twofold. First is to warn the U.S. that it's extremely dangerous to continue down this road, particularly provoking a war with Iran, because one cannot control what the repercussions would be. And in effect, they're saying also, you can't count on us to stay out of it completely under all and any circumstances without making any kind of specific commitment or threat. And we're on the way of prophecies, if you like. The second thing that they're clearly doing is that they are speaking to the Iranians on a daily basis and telling them, keep your cool. Don't allow yourself to be provoked. You know, if you do anything that provokes the Americans, they will grab onto it, and the people who are in control in Washington would use it as an excuse to start a war. Well, you know, the three places, if you like, three ways it could start, it seems. I mean, one, if you see a mounting of attacks against these residual American bases in Syria and Iraq, which are ascribed to Iran. Now, they're not those groups, by the way, leaving aside the small elements of Iranian Guard, the Revolutionary Guard. The local groups, they have a high degree of autonomy, and they have the weapons. They're not just instruments, utensils used by Tehran. And some of them, don't forget, in Iraq are the the residual ISIS people. They're Sunnis. They're not Shiites. They have no connection with Iran whatsoever. And one thinks that, I don't know this, and I haven't seen it discussed, but some of those attacks in Iraq really are not by the Shiite militias of Syria and have nothing to do with Iran, but of course that's intentionally is obscured. The second flashpoint might be if the United States decides to impose a blockade on Iran and to physically block its oil exports, which is one of the things conceivably they might have under consideration. And then if Iran were to use force to try and break that blockade, again, the people in control might say, aha, we're being attacked by the Iranians, we have to retaliate, and that would be the excuse. And there's sort of, one or two others. Iran firing some missiles that hit Israeli facilities or whatever. They would grab onto it. And that's one of the, I'm sure, people who better versed in this than I am, they're absolutely convinced that the Russians, as we said, and the Chinese are trying to avoid this by telling the Iranians, do not do anything that the Americans could use as an excuse to attack you. Now, we have an emotionally a very combustible situation. I mean, the whole Muslim Middle East, Arab, Iranian, not simply stand still if the extermination of the Gazans sort of continues unabated. Something's going to happen. And of course, the neocons in Washington, term we use loosely, but there are identifiable people. That's one, would use that again as occasion to escalate. So what, back to the question we began with, what could bring an end to this sort of American and Western dissociation from reality is very hard to identify. other than, the sinking of a couple of American aircraft carriers. I'm not even sure that that would work. And unfortunately, once you enter the realm of non-rational, non-logical, non-self-aware psychopathology, everything is possible.
Yeah, which is why it is so dangerous. It is why it is so dangerous.
And we're not prepared for it. I mean, who even comments about this? Well, first of all, dissent itself is suppressed. And you can imagine if some recognizable public figure were to get up and say what I've just been saying, what would happen to him?
No, we can only say that because we are on social media, and even that one is not going to last forever. But mainstream will never carry a discussion like this. Never.
No. I mean, you can't even allow to say call for a ceasefire in Britain or the United States or in Germany. And in Germany and in France, you're banned.
Yeah. In Germany,
as well as France, you are officially banned. And in Germany, there seem to be on the point of criminalizing it.
In Germany, a Jewish protester who protested for the Palestinians alone was arrested 10 days ago for defying a ban on protests. So it's like, but the Germans will always be the Germans. So it seems to me that we are forgetting that old wisdom that, whenever there's a war, just look at what Germany does and make sure you're not on that side. We are now forgetting that one. But the others surprised me, like France especially, and although Europe is breaking up, it's like you can see how Spain is not going along with it.
Right.
So the unity is actually crumbling at the moment, and this is going to be a problem. And Turkey is not going along with it. And actually, if NATO was ever at the point where it could lose a member, I think we're getting close to that one at the moment.
Because Erdogan is always playing his own game.
Yes, which is smart.
Which is usually not just a two-sided game, but a 3 or 4-sided game. So God knows, what aims and purposes he has in mind, which are probably several, and some of them might be self-contradictory. It's interesting his story. By the way, I mean, you mentioned the Jewish demonstrator in Germany. Well, the United States, I mean, one notable and admirable thing is that there have been demonstrations by Jewish Americans staunchly opposed to American policy,
yes,
calling for a ceasefire, and I mean that indeed the humanity and the well-being of the Palestinians to be recognized. These are people in their hundreds, and some demonstrations who demonstrated outside the United Nations. They demonstrated in the Capitol itself in Washington. And they occupied Grand Central Station last week. And some of them symbolically draped themselves in Jewish prayer shawls. So, these are
encouraging signs. Encouraging signs.
That at least there is, in a few souls, there is some human instinct that's still alive. And of course, there's this, Judaism was the source of one of mankind's great humanistic traditions. And don't forget, I mean, the standard prayers for centuries in Jewish services, that was asking the Lord's blessing and for peace among all peoples. And of course, that stands in direct contradiction to those parts of the Bible obedient to Yahweh, who of course is nothing but a tribal warrior god. And the universal God, we became, El Elohim, was borrowed from the Phoenicians. In fact, that root, the El was a great Phoenician god who was sort of like a divine ground of being. He didn't meddle in human affairs. And that's the same root as Allah. So, and the great humanistic strand of Jewish sort of eschatology was expressed in the prophets, beginning with the prophets in Mesopotamia.
Yeah, and
during the exile, and then picked up and then continued by some of the prophets in Judea when they return. Of course, the ultimate prophet preaching that, the ultimate Jewish prophet preaching that was Jesus Christ.
Exactly. And he was willing to die on the cross for purging the sins.
Well, remember what he said, "Dear God, why have you abandoned me?" So we're not sure who Jesus was willing.
At least that's the belief, right? And it's a good belief that you have a prophet of reconciliation, of peace, and of peacefulness, who would literally defend a prostitute by saying, like, you without the one without sin shall throw the first stone. Like, this is beautiful messaging, and that is still there. The thing is, it's not adhered. It's just not adhered.
No, I mean, Jesus' Christianity was diluted so rapidly and became kind of window dressing by the 2nd century AD.
Of course,
and individuals have taken it to heart and are Christians in the sense that Jesus was preaching, but institutionalized Christianity, of course, never has, much less states and governments. Well, that happens to every religion. This is not an anti-Christian statement.
It seems to me.
Look what's happened to Judaism in Israel. I mean, even think of one think the last people who would religious community that would take this route would be the Buddhists. But look at the Buddhist monks in Burma, who were the ones who were stoking anti-Rohingya, anti-Muslim.
Once you put any group together, whatever faith or whatever the constellation, once they start self-organizing and once they become bigger in terms of hierarchical structures, you automatically end up in systems of violence. It's the structure that then determines the movement of these groups.
Well, Western societies, of course, from several sources, I mean, both in the better version of religious traditions and, of course, the humanistic values of the Enlightenment, have succeeded, or seemingly succeeded, at least to the last 75 years, in constituting communities and political communities and societies which in a broad sense are humanistic. Now, we're in the process, not just in regard to attitudes towards Gaza, but one could argue in other senses as well, of throwing it away, which would be the ultimate act of destruction. I mean, in a way, in societal terms, I mean, it's the greatest achievement of humankind. you know, the humane and humanistic societies of the West of the last 75 years are now from several directions is being attacked and undermined, including by neo-fascists in the United States and autocratic movements and tendencies elsewhere, which is, I guess, the ultimate tragedy.
The question is, can these humanistic societies exist without a significant other on the outside? You know, is the outside enemy a prerequisite for the humanism inside to exist? Because we see that now, how this humanistic bubble and value Hippocratic idea is now again directed against against an outside force, and how some parts of the community try to use it as a unifying factor, although it seems to fail. It seems to be failing, but we see the attempt.
I don't think really you need an enemy or a foe or a threat. Most people are quite content with a good life. I mean, when that begins to erode, in a sense, and as societies become, in effect, atomized, and we become alienated from society, in some cases from ourselves, when narcissism becomes the implicit national religion, then the way opens for all kinds of abnormalities, right? And a sense of dissatisfaction and discontent, grievances can grow, and then they can be exploited by the kinds of people who are always there. And that's what's been happening in the United States. I mean, you have one of our two main parties completely taken over by groups and doctrines and so forth, which essentially are anti-liberal or anti the very societies and cultures that we've cultivated and developed and institutionalized over, well, it didn't begin 75 years ago. In many countries it began, a century earlier, but which took full form, nothing after World War II. And now the people who want to destroy it, in the United States at least, are in a position to destroy it. There are other forces as well, the predatory financial element, but let's not get into that.
No, and Michael, we've been talking now already for, I think, 70 or 80 minutes. So I do thank you for this discussion, and we will continue again another time on the next issue.
Well, thank you very much. And, I sort of envy you living in what still seems to be a very civilized Japanese society, the society of modern Japan. It seems very civil.
So far,
even if they don't make and enjoy scrolls.
I will explain this in the comments. Thank you very much, Michael.
You can cut that. You can cut this.
See you next time.
Okay, thank you.